Florence, 1881. The city of the Renaissance still breathed with the memory of Michelangelo and Medici princes, its cobblestone streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. In this ancient cradle of art and commerce, a boy named Guccio Gucci was born into a world that promised him nothing. His father made hats. His mother took in sewing. The family lived in modest rooms, where the smell of leather and thread mixed with the damp stone odor of old buildings. Young Guccio would watch his father's hands work the felt and fabric, transforming raw material into something refined, something that might adorn the head of a gentleman. But even as a child, Guccio understood that his father would never be the gentleman. He would only serve them. This understanding became the engine of his ambition. At 14, Guccio left Florence. He traveled to Paris, then London, drawn by rumors of opportunity and the magnetic pull of wealth he had never known. In London, he found work at the Savoy Hotel, one of the most prestigious establishments in the world. It was 1897, and the Savoy represented everything the industrial age had made possible: electric lights, elevators, hot and cold running water, and an endless parade of the global elite passing through its gilded doors. Guccio worked as a dishwasher, a porter, a bellhop. He carried luggage for aristocrats and industrialists, for Russian counts and American railroad magnates. He observed everything: the leather of their suitcases, the stitching on their travel cases, the way wealth announced itself, not through volume, but through quality, through details that only the trained eye could appreciate. He noticed how certain guests commanded respect simply by the objects they possessed, how a perfectly crafted trunk could convey more about status than words ever could. The rich, he learned, did not simply buy things. They bought emblems of their superiority, talismans that separated them from ordinary life. Late at night, in the servants' quarters, Guccio would sketch designs in stolen moments, not copies of what he had seen, but improvements. His mind worked like a jeweler examining a flawed diamond, seeing not what was, but what could be. He began to understand luxury, not as excess, but as perfection, pursued to the point of obsession. Every stitch mattered. Every grain of leather told a story. The aristocrats who stayed at the Savoy were not buying function. They were buying immortality, a way to stop time and announce that they existed on a different plane than the masses struggling below. This revelation would shape everything that followed. When Guccio returned to Florence in 1921, he was 40 years old and possessed by a singular vision. The First World War had ended, leaving Europe traumatized and transformed. Old empires had collapsed, millions had died, but in the ruins of the old order, new opportunities emerged. The world was being remade, and Guccio sensed that in this remaking, there would be hunger for beauty, for quality, for objects that reminded people that civilization had not entirely perished in the trenches. He opened a small shop at 7 Via della Vigna Nuova in Florence. The space was modest, barely large enough for a workshop and a display area. He sold leather goods, handbags, suitcases, riding equipment. But from the very beginning, Guccio approached his work with a philosophy that transcended mere commerce. He was not selling products. He was selling a promise. The promise was this: that by owning a Gucci creation, you entered a realm of exclusivity, that you became part of an invisible aristocracy, defined not by blood, but by taste. He was obsessive about materials. The leather had to be perfect. No blemishes, no weaknesses. He personally inspected every hide, running his hands over the surface. searching for imperfections with the intensity of a man searching for heresy. His craftsmen, recruited from generations of Florentine artisans, learned quickly that working for Gucci meant accepting nothing less than perfection. A bag that was 99% perfect was a failure. It was thrown away, the materials wasted, the hours of labor meaningless. This was not cruelty. This was religious devotion. Gucci understood something fundamental about human psychology, something that would prove both the foundation of his fortune and the poison that would eventually destroy his family. He understood that people do not desire what is easily obtained. They desire what is rare, what is difficult, what separates them from the crowd. So he made Gucci rare. He produced limited quantities. He turned customers away if he sensed they did not truly appreciate what they were buying. He created waiting lists before waiting lists became a symbol of luxury culture. This artificial scarcity was not a marketing trick, or rather, it was the most sophisticated marketing trick ever conceived, and so subtle that even those who fell under its spell did not recognize they were being manipulated. The equestrian world became his first conquest. Wealthy Italians, British expatriates, un-American tourists who rode horses or aspired to the lifestyle of those who did. These became his core customers. Riding boots, saddles, stirrups, bridles, each piece carried the Gucci signature, and slowly that signature began to mean something. It began to whisper, "You have arrived. You're not like others. You have discernment." In 1933, Gucci made a decision that would echo through decades. He began using a double G logo, his initials interlocked in an elegant cipher. The symbol was simple, but carried profound psychological weight. It was a signature, a seal, a brand in the ancient sense, a mark burned into the hide of an animal to show ownership. By placing his initials on his products, Gucci was not simply identifying the maker. He was claiming ownership of the customer's identity. When you carried a Gucci bag, you carried Guccio's name. You became an advertisement for his taste, his vision, his standards. You became, in a sense, his property. But Gucci was also a family man, shaped by the Italian conviction that blood meant everything. He married Ida Calvelli, and together they had 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. Grimalda, Vasco, Aldo, Ugo, Rodolfo, and Bruno. From their earliest years, the sons understood that they were not simply children. They were heirs to something larger than themselves. Their father's obsession became their inheritance. The education they received was peculiar and totalizing. Gucci did not send them to business schools or universities in the traditional sense. He apprenticed them in the shop, teaching them to evaluate leather, to understand stitching, to recognize quality with the instinct of predators recognizing prey. But more than craft, he taught them worldview. He taught them that the world was divided between those who created beauty and those who consumed it, between the rare and the common, between Gucci and everyone else. This was not education. This was indoctrination. Aldo, the third son, proved particularly receptive to his father's gospel. Born in 1905, Aldo possessed a charisma that Gucci lacked, a natural ability to charm and persuade. Where Gucci was intense and severe, Aldo was warm and expansive. But beneath the charm lay the same ruthless commitment to the family's elevation. As Aldo grew older, he began to see possibilities beyond Florence, beyond Italy. He envisioned Gucci as a global empire, with outposts in every major city, a network of exclusivity spanning continents. Rodolfo, younger than Aldo by 11 years, was different. handsome and sensitive, Rodolfo harbored artistic ambitions. He became an actor, performing under the stage name Maurizio da Ancora in Italian films of the 1930s and 1940s. For a time, it seemed he might escape the family business entirely, might forge his own identity separate from his father's consuming vision. But the gravitational pull of Gucci proved too strong. Blood was blood. Legacy was legacy. Eventually, Rodolfo returned to the fold, bringing with him the refinement and image consciousness of the film world, qualities that would shape the brand's aesthetic evolution. The Second World War arrived and devastated Europe once again. Italy, under Mussolini's fascist regime, aligned with Nazi Germany and paid a catastrophic price. Cities were bombed. Millions died or disappeared. The economy collapsed, but the Gucci workshop survived, and in surviving, it gained something valuable: scarcity of materials. Leather became almost impossible to obtain. Guccio and his sons improvised, experimenting with alternative materials: canvas, bamboo, woven fabrics. They created the bamboo-handled bag, a design born of necessity that would become iconic. After the war, as Europe slowly rebuilt, a new class emerged: wealthy Americans eager to tour the ruins of the old world and to purchase pieces of European sophistication. They came to Florence, these tourists and soldiers and new millionaires, and they discovered Gucci. The shop on Via della Vigna Nuova became a pilgrimage site for those seeking authentic Italian luxury. The Gucci name began appearing in gossip columns and society pages. Hollywood stars, flush with wartime profits from entertainment-hungry audiences, bought Gucci luggage and handbags. Lauren Bacall, Ingrid Bergman, Grace Kelly, their names became linked with the brand, creating an association between Gucci and a certain kind of effortless, cinematic elegance. Guccio watched this transformation with satisfaction, but also with anxiety. Success brought new dangers. Competitors emerged. Imitators tried to copy his designs. The exclusivity he had so carefully cultivated was under threat from the very popularity he had worked to create. This paradox, that success contained the seeds of dilution, haunted him. He became even more controlling, more demanding, more paranoid about maintaining standards. His sons, now grown men with families of their own, chafed under his authoritarian rule. They had their own ideas, their own ambitions. Aldo, in particular, began pushing for aggressive expansion. He wanted to open stores in New York, in London, in Paris. He wanted Gucci to become a truly international brand, not just a Florentine curiosity. But Guccio resisted. Growth meant risk. Growth meant losing control. Growth meant that the perfect vision he held in his mind might be corrupted by distance and delegation. The tension between father and sons grew, taking on the character of ancient drama. Guccio had built an empire on the principle of absolute control. But he had also created heirs who inherited his ambition and his refusal to submit. The contradiction was fundamental and inescapable. In trying to build a dynasty, he had created the conditions for its eventual war with itself. In 1953, Guccio Gucci died at the age of 72. His death marked the end of the founder's era and the beginning of something more complex and dangerous. The business passed to his sons, primarily Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo. His death should have been a moment of transition, of a younger generation stepping into earned authority. Instead, it was the moment when the fault lines began to show. With the patriarch gone, there was no ultimate arbiter, No single voice that could claim absolute legitimacy. The sons inherited wealth, a respected name, and a growing business. But they also inherited their father's philosophy, that the world was divided between the worthy and the unworthy. That compromise was weakness. That control was everything. Each son believed he alone truly understood Guccio's vision. Each believed he alone was fit to lead, and each was willing to destroy his brothers to prove it. The dynasty Guccio had built was not a gift to his sons. It was a curse disguised as inheritance. He had taught them to be ruthless, to accept nothing less than absolute authority, to view the world through the lens of domination and exclusivity. These were excellent traits for building a luxury brand. They were catastrophic traits for maintaining family unity. In the years immediately following Guccio's death, the brothers maintained a fragile cooperation. The business was expanding rapidly. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Gucci had stores in Milan, Rome, and most significantly, New York. The Fifth Avenue store, unopened by Aldo in 1953, the same year his father died, became a symbol of the brand's arrival on the global stage. American celebrities and socialites lined up to buy Gucci loafers and handbags. The company was printing money, but money changed nothing about the fundamental problem. Perhaps money made the problem worse, because now there was not just pride at stake. Now there was fortune. Now there was power that extended beyond family reputation into the realm of global influence. The Gucci name appeared in fashion magazines and social registers. Politicians and movie stars wore their products. The family was invited to galas and premieres. They were no longer artisans. They were aristocrats of commerce, self-made nobility in an age that claimed to have abolished such distinctions. This success should have been triumph. Instead, it was the foundation of tragedy, because each brother looked at the empire and saw, reflected back, not a collective achievement, but a personal throne that rightfully belonged to him alone. The seeds Guccio had planted, the obsession with control, the conviction of superiority, the belief that compromise was corruption, had taken root in his sons' souls. Now those seeds were growing into something dark and twisted, something that would eventually choke the very garden it had sprung from. The birth of the dynasty was complete. What followed would be its slow, agonizing death. By 1960, Gucci was no longer just a luxury brand. It had become a phenomenon, a symbol of a particular kind of post-war prosperity that married old-world craftsmanship with new-world ambition. The red and green stripe, derived from the traditional saddle girth, became instantly recognizable. The double G logo appeared on everything from handbags to scarves to loafers. The horse-bit motif, borrowed from equestrian culture, adorned shoes and belts. These were not merely design elements. They were hieroglyphics of status, immediately legible to those who understood the language of luxury. Aldo Gucci had emerged as the driving force behind this expansion. Charismatic and relentless, he possessed a salesman's instinct for reading people and a strategist's ability to see opportunities others missed. He understood that luxury was not about quality alone. It was about storytelling. He crafted narratives around Gucci products, linking them to Italian nobility, Renaissance craftsmanship, timeless elegance. He courted celebrities and socialites, offering them free products in exchange for being photographed with them. This was revolutionary at the time, a precursor to modern influencer marketing. Aldo opened stores in London, Palm Beach, Beverly Hills and Paris. Each location was chosen not just for its wealth but for its symbolic significance. These were the capitals of the global elite, the cities where power and money and culture intersected. By planting the Gucci flag in these territories, Aldo was declaring that his family belonged in the highest echelons of society. The boy whose grandfather made hats, whose father carried luggage at the Savoy, was now dining with Kennedy and Kissinger, with movie producers and European royalty. But this expansion created structural problems that would metastasize over the following decades. As Gucci grew, it required more capital, more management, more coordination. The company remained family-owned, with ownership divided among the brothers, and eventually their children. But family ownership of a complex, multinational corporation creates nightmares of governance. Who makes final decisions? How are profits distributed? What happens when family members disagree about strategy? Aldo appointed himself president and de facto leader. His brothers Vasco and Rodolfo held positions of authority, but increasingly they found themselves subordinate to Aldo's vision and Aldo's ego. Vasco, the eldest brother, I was less interested in power struggles and more focused on manufacturing and quality control. He remained in Florence, overseeing production, maintaining his father's standards of craftsmanship. But this meant he was geographically and psychologically removed from the centers of power: New York, where Aldo reigned, and Milan, where Rodolfo increasingly operated. Rodolfo presented a more complicated challenge. Still handsome in middle age, carrying himself with the elegance of his acting years, Rodolfo resented playing second fiddle to Aldo. He believed his aesthetic sensibility was superior, that he understood luxury in a way his more commercial brother did not. Rodolfo saw Aldo as a salesman, a huckster who had corrupted their father's vision by pursuing growth at the expense of exclusivity. This was not entirely unfair. Aldo was indeed expanding the brand aggressively, licensing the Gucci name to products the founder would have rejected: perfumes, watches, accessories that strayed far from the leather goods and equestrian equipment that defined the original vision. The philosophical divide between the brothers reflected a fundamental tension in luxury branding. Is it better to remain small and exclusive, or to grow large and profit from mass aspiration? Rodolfo advocated for the former. Keep production limited, prices high, quality uncompromising. Aldo advocated for the latter. Expand the product line, open more stores, make Gucci a household name. Both positions had merit. Both contained seeds of disaster. What made the conflict particularly toxic was that it was not really about business strategy. It was about pride. It was about which brother truly carried their father's legacy, which one deserved the patriarch's mantle. These men, shaped by Guccio's authoritarian vision, could not conceive of shared leadership or democratic decision-making. Their father had been an absolute monarch. They each aspired to the same absolutism. But multiple absolute monarchs cannot coexist in one kingdom. The wealth itself became a corrosive force. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Gucci family was immensely rich. They owned villas in Italy, apartments in Manhattan and Paris, estates in the countryside. They collected art. They wore bespoke suits and handmade shoes. They sent their children to elite schools. They moved through the world with the confidence of people who had transcended ordinary concerns like mortgages and medical bills and retirement planning. But this wealth did not bring peace. If anything, it amplified every petty resentment and ancient grievance. When you are struggling, certain conflicts seem insignificant. You are too busy surviving to nurse old wounds. But when you are wealthy, when all material needs are satisfied, the psyche turns inward and begins feeding on itself. Slights that would have been forgotten become obsessions. Disagreements that could have been resolved through compromise become battlegrounds for ego and pride. Aldo's sons entered the business in the 1970s, adding a new generation to the power structure. Giorgio, Paolo, and Roberto Gucci all took positions in the company, learning the business from their father and uncles. But Aldo's relationship with his sons, particularly Paolo, was complicated by the same authoritarianism that had defined Guccio's relationship with his sons. Aldo demanded absolute loyalty. He viewed his sons not as partners, but as extensions of his will. When they showed independence or creativity that diverged from his vision, he crushed it. Paolo, in particular, harbored design ambitions. He created sketches and prototypes, dreaming of launching his own line within the Gucci universe. But Aldo dismissed his efforts, criticizing his taste and his business sense. The rejection was not merely professional, it was personal and cutting. Paolo began to feel like an outsider in his own family, unappreciated and disrespected. This resentment would have catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, Rodolfo had married and had a son named Maurizio, born in 1948. Maurizio Gucci grew up in a world of extraordinary privilege, insulated from ordinary life by wealth and family name. Rodolfo doted on his only child, especially after his wife Alessandra died when Maurizio was young. The boy became the focus of Rodolfo's hopes and ambitions, the vessel into which he poured his dreams of the family's future. Maurizio was educated at elite schools, but showed little interest in the craftsmanship that had defined his grandfather's vision. He was charming, handsome, and somewhat directionless. A young man who had inherited wealth and status without inheriting the obsessive work ethic that had created them. Rodolfo tried to toughen him, to instill in him the discipline necessary to lead a global luxury empire. But Maurizio remained somewhat soft, somewhat passive, uncontent to enjoy the benefits of his name without fully embracing its burdens. In the early 1970s, Maurizio met Patrizia Reggiani at a party in Milan. She was beautiful, ambitious, and from a working-class background. Her father was a trucking magnate who had built a successful business, but lacked the aristocratic pedigree the Gucci family valued. Patrizia was intelligent and socially astute, capable of navigating the worlds of wealth and power with the skill of someone who had studied them from the outside before gaining entry. Maurizio fell deeply in love. Patrizia represented something his privileged existence had lacked: passion, hunger, danger. She was not content with comfort. She wanted more status, more recognition, more power. In Maurizio, she saw not just a man, but a vehicle to the very pinnacle of Italian society. In Patrizia, Maurizio saw escape from his father's suffocating expectations and the internecine warfare of his family. When Maurizio announced his intention to marry Patrizia, Rodolfo exploded. This was betrayal. This was contamination of the bloodline. Patrizia was not good enough, not refined enough, not educated enough. Rodolfo threatened to disinherit his son if the marriage proceeded. The threat was not idle. Italian law allowed parents significant control over inheritance. and Rodolfo could legally structure his estate to exclude Maurizio if he chose. Maurizio, for perhaps the first time in his life, defied his father. In 1972, he married Patrizia Reggiani. The wedding was elegant but marked by absence. Rodolfo did not attend. The father-son relationship, already strained, fractured completely. For 2 years, they did not speak. Maurizio was cut off financially, forced to work at entry-level positions in the family business, treated like any other employee rather than an heir. But Rodolfo eventually relented. Blood proved stronger than pride. Or perhaps he recognized that continuing the feud would only drive his son further away. He reconciled with Maurizio and, grudgingly, with Patrizia. She entered the family, not as a welcomed daughter-in-law, but as a tolerated intruder, always aware that she was considered beneath them, always resentful of their condescension. Patrizia responded by becoming more Gucci than the Guccis. She studied their history, their values, their aesthetic. She dressed impeccably, hosted lavish parties, cultivated relationships with Milan's elite. She was determined to prove that she belonged, that she was not just Maurizio's wife, but a force in her own right. This determination would shape everything that followed. By the late 1970s, the tensions within the family had become operational problems. Board meetings devolved into shouting matches. Strategic decisions were held hostage to personal animosities. Aldo and Rodolfo barely spoke. Paolo felt disrespected and marginalized. The younger generation, Maurizio and his cousins, watched and learned that family meant warfare, that love was secondary to control, that compromise was weakness. The business continued to grow, almost despite itself. The Gucci name was so powerful, the brand equity so substantial, that even mismanagement and internal chaos could not entirely derail its momentum. Stores opened, products sold, revenues climbed, but the foundation was rotting. The family was consuming itself from within, and the poison was beginning to spread into the corporate structure. In 1982, Rodolfo died of prostate cancer. His death was the beginning of the end. Though no one recognized it at the time, Rodolfo left his 50% stake in Gucci to his son, Maurizio. Overnight, the young man who had shown little interest in business, who had lived a comfortable but somewhat aimless existence, found himself in possession of enormous power. He owned half the company. The other half was split among Aldo and his sons. This created a nightmare scenario. Maurizio, influenced by Patrizia and by his own growing sense of entitlement, decided he wanted control. He wanted to be not just a shareholder, but the leader of Gucci. He wanted to push Aldo and his sons aside, to cleanse the company of what he viewed as their corrupting influence, to restore his grandfather's vision, or at least his romanticized version of it. But there was a problem. Shortly before Rodolfo's death, there had been a falling out with Maurizio over business decisions. Rodolfo, in anger, had written a will that appeared to disinherit his son, leaving his shares to Maurizio's daughters instead. The will was contested immediately. Maurizio claimed it was invalid, that his father had been suffering from cancer and heavily medicated when he signed it, that he lacked the mental capacity to make such a decision. The legal battle that ensued was vicious and public. Family members testified against each other. Private correspondence was read in court. The Gucci family's dysfunction was laid bare for the Italian and international press, which covered the proceedings with the enthusiasm of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. The myth of the elegant, refined Gucci family was replaced by the reality of a clan at war with itself, motivated not by artistry or legacy, but by naked greed and wounded pride. Maurizio eventually won the legal battle. The court ruled in his favor, and he took control of his father's 50% stake. He was now the largest single shareholder in Gucci, a position that gave him enormous leverage. But his victory came at a cost. The legal fees were substantial. The family relationships were destroyed beyond repair. And most dangerously, Maurizio had revealed himself to be ruthless in pursuit of control, willing to drag the family name through the mud if it served his purposes. This revelation was not lost on Aldo and his sons. If Maurizio could do this to his own father's memory, what would he do to them? The answer came quickly and brutally. Maurizio began working to force Aldo out of the company. He allied with outside investors, sought external financing, and maneuvered to dilute Aldo's stake, the old man who had built the modern Gucci empire, who had opened stores around the world and made the family name synonymous with luxury, found himself under attack from his own nephew. Aldo fought back, but he was old and tired and facing problems on multiple fronts. The American Internal Revenue Service had been investigating him for tax evasion. In 1986, Aldo was convicted of evading taxes on millions of dollars of income. The conviction was devastating, not just financially but reputationally. Aldo Gucci, the man who had cultivated relationships with presidents and movie stars, was sentenced to a year in prison. He was 71 years old. The humiliation broke him. Aldo served his time, but when he emerged, he was a diminished figure. The empire he had built was slipping from his control, seized by a nephew he had watched grow up, a nephew he had never taken seriously. Maurizio showed no mercy. In 1988, Aldo sold his shares in Gucci. He died in 1990. Isolated and embittered, estranged from his sons and the company he had dedicated his life to building. The tragedy of Aldo's fall was that it was entirely predictable. He had practiced the same ruthless exclusion of others that was now being practiced on him. He had viewed his own sons as subordinates rather than partners, just as his nephew now viewed him as an obstacle rather than an elder deserving respect. The cycle of domination and humiliation that Guccio had set in motion was playing out with mathematical precision. Maurizio was now in control. But control of what? The family was shattered. The company was plagued by debt and internal chaos. And most ominously, Maurizio himself was revealing himself to be not a visionary leader, but a dilettante playing at power. A man who had won a throne but had no idea how to govern from it. The crown he had fought so hard to claim was already beginning to feel like a weight that would drag him down. Power had been achieved, but power, as the Gucci family was learning, was not the same as victory. It was simply a more elevated platform from which to fall. The 1980s marked the transformation of the Gucci family conflict, from private dysfunction to public spectacle. What had been whispered about in boardrooms and discussed in hushed tones at society gatherings now exploded into the newspapers and courtrooms of Italy and beyond. The family that had represented elegance and refinement was revealed to be something else entirely. A Greek tragedy in custom suits. A dynasty eating itself alive while the world watched in fascination and horror. Paolo Gucci, Aldo's son, became the unlikely catalyst for this exposure. For years, Paolo had endured his father's dismissals and criticisms. He had submitted to the family hierarchy, accepting that his ideas were unwelcome. his creativity suppressed. But by the early 1980s, something inside him snapped. Perhaps it was accumulated resentment finally reaching critical mass. Perhaps it was the recognition that he would never receive the respect he craved while playing by the family's rules. Whatever the cause, Paolo decided to rebel. He began designing products under his own name, attempting to establish himself independent of the Gucci brand. But the family viewed this as heresy, a betrayal of the collective enterprise. Aldo sued his own son for trademark infringement, arguing that Paolo's use of the Gucci name, even his own legal name, violated the family's intellectual property. The lawsuit was breathtaking in its cruelty. Aldo was, in effect, trying to strip his son of his identity, to legally prohibit him from using the name he was born with. Paolo did not retreat. Instead, he escalated. If the family wanted war, he would give them war. He began cooperating with authorities investigating Gucci's financial practices. He provided documents showing tax evasion, questionable accounting, hidden income. He testified against his father and uncles, detailing decades of financial impropriety. This was not whistleblowing motivated by conscience. This was vengeance, pure and righteous in its destructiveness. The information Paolo provided led directly to Aldo's conviction and imprisonment. Father and son, bound by blood and business, became mortal enemies. Paolo was disowned, expelled from the family business, cut off financially. He attempted to launch his own fashion line but failed, crushed by legal fees and the impossibility of competing against the Gucci empire. He died in 1995 at 54, broken and penniless. Estranged from his family and forgotten by the industry he had tried to conquer. Paolo's tragedy illuminated something essential about the Gucci family dynamic. Dissent was not tolerated, and disloyalty was punished with annihilation. The family operated on the principle of absolute unity, or, more accurately, absolute submission to whoever wielded the most power. This was not a partnership of equals pursuing a common vision. This was a hierarchical system where questioning authority was equivalent to treason. But Paolo's rebellion was not the only front in the family wars. While he fought his father, Maurizio was waging his own campaign for absolute control. After securing his father's shares and engineering Aldo's downfall, Maurizio set his sights on acquiring the remaining shares held by his cousins. He wanted 100% ownership, not just a controlling stake. He wanted to be sole proprietor of the Gucci empire, to exercise the kind of absolute authority his grandfather had possessed. To achieve this, Maurizio needed capital. The buyouts and legal battles had drained his finances, so he turned to outside investors, particularly an investment firm called InvestCorp. Founded by Bahraini businessman Namir Kirdar, InvestCorp specialized in acquiring and restructuring luxury brands. They saw opportunity in Gucci, a legendary name whose business operations had been mismanaged by family squabbles, but whose brand equity remained immense. In 1988, Maurizio sold 50% of Gucci to InvestCorp for hundreds of millions of dollars. The influx of cash allowed him to buy out his cousins and consolidate control. By 1989, Maurizio was chairman and sole Gucci family member in the company's leadership. He had won. The family business was his alone to command, but this victory was Pyrrhic in ways Maurizio did not yet understand. By bringing in outside investors, he had fatally compromised the family's control. InvestCorp was not interested in legacy or tradition. They were interested in returns on investment. They expected professional management, strategic coherence, and financial performance. Maurizio, it quickly became apparent, was incapable of providing any of these things. As CEO, Maurizio made a series of catastrophic decisions. He embarked on an ambitious and expensive rebranding effort, hiring fashion designers and launching new product lines. Some of these initiatives showed creative promise, but they were poorly executed and inadequately marketed. Maurizio was acting out a fantasy of himself as a visionary leader, but he lacked the discipline and business acumen to translate vision into reality. More damaging was Maurizio's lifestyle. He spent extravagantly on personal indulgences, renovations to his homes, a yacht, art collections. He traveled constantly, often accompanied by his new girlfriend, Paola Franchi, while his wife Patrizia remained in Milan, humiliated and increasingly furious. The company's money and Maurizio's money had become indistinguishable in his mind. He was Gucci, and Gucci was him. The distinction between personal and corporate finances dissolved entirely. By the early 1990s, Gucci was hemorrhaging money. Losses reached tens of millions of dollars annually. The brand, once synonymous with exclusivity and quality, was becoming diluted by poor management and inconsistent product offerings. Investcorp grew alarmed. They had invested hundreds of millions expecting to profit from a turnaround. Instead, they were watching Maurizio drive the company toward bankruptcy. The relationship between Maurizio and Investcorp deteriorated rapidly. Board meetings became confrontational. Investcorp demanded changes, cost-cutting, management restructuring, strategic refocusing. Maurizio resisted, viewing these demands as interference with his authority. He had fought so hard to control Gucci, he could not accept that his control was illusory, that he was now answerable to investors who cared nothing for family legacy. In 1993, Investcorp forced Maurizio out. It was a palace coup executed with corporate efficiency. One day, Maurizio was CEO and majority shareholder. The next, he was unemployed, and his shares were being acquired by the very investors he had brought in to secure his control. The irony was devastating. Maurizio had destroyed his family's unity and his uncle's legacy in pursuit of absolute power, only to lose everything to bankers and investment firms. For Maurizio, the humiliation was total. He was 45 years old, estranged from his cousins, divorced from his wife, and exiled from the company that bore his name. The Gucci empire his grandfather had founded and his father had helped build was now owned by foreigners who cared nothing for the family's history. Maurizio retreated to Milan, living off the proceeds from the sale of his shares, trying to maintain the lifestyle he had always known, while his world contracted around him. Meanwhile, Patrizia Reggiani was experiencing her own catastrophic collapse. Maurizio had left her in 1985, abandoning their marriage for Paola Franchi. The separation was sudden and cruel. Maurizio literally fled one day, while Patrizia was away, leaving her to discover his absence when she returned home. For a woman who had defined herself through her position as Mrs. Gucci, who had fought for acceptance and clawed her way into Milan's elite, the abandonment was not just personal rejection, but existential annihilation. Patrizia fought the divorce for years, refusing to accept that the marriage was over. But Italian law eventually granted Maurizio's petition, and the divorce was finalized in 1994. Patrizia received a settlement, substantial by ordinary standards, but modest compared to the wealth she had enjoyed during the marriage. More galling than the money was the loss of status. She was no longer Mrs. Maurizio Gucci. She was simply Patrizia Reggiani, daughter of a trucking magnate, expelled from the aristocratic world she had worked so hard to enter. The psychological impact on Patrizia was profound and dark. Friends later recalled that she became obsessed with Maurizio, unable to move forward, consumed by rage and betrayal. She underwent surgery for a brain tumor in 1992, and some would later speculate that the tumor and subsequent trauma affected her mental state. Though this was never definitively established, what was clear was that Patrizia's identity had been so thoroughly merged with her role as Maurizio's wife that losing that role left her unmoored and desperate. She began seeing a fortune-teller and spiritual advisor named Pina Auriemma. This relationship would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. Pina was a Naples native with connections to various shady characters, not quite criminals, but operating in the gray zones of Italian society. She became Patrizia's confidant and eventually her co-conspirator. As 1994 turned into 1995, Patrizia's obsession with Maurizio intensified. She hired private investigators to follow him. She learned about his financial situation, that he had lost control of Gucci, that he was living off the proceeds of the sale, that he was still with Paola. Each piece of information fed her rage. Maurizio had destroyed her life to be with another woman, and he had not even maintained the power and status that might have made his betrayal comprehensible. He had sacrificed everything for nothing. Exactly when Patrizia decided that Maurizio had to die is unclear. Perhaps there was no single moment of decision, just a gradual progression from wishing him misfortune to actively seeking his destruction. What is known is that by early 1995, Patrizia was discussing the possibility of murder with Pina Auriemma. The other family members, meanwhile, were scattered and diminished. Paolo was dying, isolated and impoverished. Aldo's other sons, Giorgio and Roberto, had been bought out and pushed aside, nursing their own resentments. The third generation of Guccis had been raised to believe they were royalty, that the family name was a guarantee of status and influence. Instead, they had learned that the name was a curse, that it brought out the worst in everyone who carried it, that it transformed normal human weaknesses into tragic flaws. The psychological damage inflicted by the family wars was incalculable. Children who had grown up witnessing their fathers and uncles destroy each other could not help but internalize those lessons. They learned that family loyalty was conditional, that love was transactional, that the pursuit of power justified any betrayal. These were not lessons anyone intended to teach, but they were lessons that soaked into the bones of everyone touched by the Gucci dysfunction. The poison of greed had metastasized throughout the family system. But greed is an insufficient explanation for what happened. People are greedy every day without destroying their families. The Gucci tragedy was about something deeper. The toxic combination of money, pride, and a worldview that equated worth with dominance. Guccio had built his empire on the principle that some people were simply better than others, that excellence gave you the right to rule. His sons and grandsons had inherited this principle and turned it inward, applying it to each other. If some people were better than others, then within the family itself, there must be a hierarchy. There must be winners and losers. There must be a king. This mentality made peaceful coexistence impossible. Every interaction became a power struggle. Every business decision became a referendum on who truly deserved to lead. The family members were incapable of viewing each other as partners or even as human beings worthy of respect. They viewed each other as obstacles, rivals, and eventually as enemies who had to be vanquished. By 1995, the family wars had achieved everything except what anyone wanted. The empire was lost to outsiders. The family was scattered and broken. The name that had represented luxury and elegance now represented dysfunction and greed. And in Milan, a woman named Patrizia Reggiani was planning a murder that would complete the family's descent from dynasty to cautionary tale. The wars were about to claim their final victim. The only question was whether anyone would care enough to mourn him. March 27th, 1995. Milan. Morning. The city was awakening to another day of commerce and culture, its streets filling with professionals heading to offices and studios. Maurizio Gucci, 56 years old, climbed the marble steps to his office building at Via Palestro 20. It was a building he knew well, where he still maintained offices even after losing control of the company that bore his name. He had spent the night at his apartment with Paola Franchi, the woman he planned to marry now that his divorce from Patrizia was final. He was dressed elegantly, as always. Gucci was still his name, even if it was no longer his company. At approximately 8:30 a.m., as Maurizio approached the entrance, a man emerged from the shadows. The man was dressed in a casual jacket, unremarkable, the kind of person you would glance at and forget immediately. He raised a pistol. Maurizio, in the final seconds of his life, saw what was coming. There was time to register shock, but not to run. The gunman fired 3 shots into Maurizio's back. As Maurizio collapsed on the steps, the gunman stood over him and fired a 4th shot into his head. Then the man calmly walked to a green Renault waiting nearby and disappeared into Milan's morning traffic. The execution had taken less than 15 seconds. Giuseppe Onorato, the building's porter who had been nearby, lay wounded by a shot intended to silence any witnesses. He survived. Maurizio did not. News of the murder spread through Milan within hours and around the world within days. Maurizio Gucci, heir to a fashion dynasty, had been assassinated in broad daylight. The killing bore all the hallmarks of a professional hit: the calm precision, the execution-style shots, the clean getaway. Immediately, speculation erupted. Was this connected to business dealings? To the family wars that had consumed the Guccis for decades? To the underworld figures who sometimes intersected with the luxury industry? The Italian police launched an investigation, but for months they found nothing. The gunman had left no fingerprints, no physical evidence. Witnesses provided vague descriptions that fit thousands of men in Milan. The green Renault was found abandoned, stolen weeks earlier, yielding no useful forensic evidence. Maurizio's murder seemed destined to join the ranks of unsolved mysteries, a cold case that would generate speculation but never resolution. Patrizia Reggiani, when informed of her ex-husband's death, reacted with what observers described as theatrical grief. She attended the funeral dressed in black, weeping openly, playing the role of devastated widow despite their bitter divorce. To some, her performance seemed genuine. To others, it seemed excessive, calculated. But grief is strange and individual, and no one thought to immediately suspect the elegant woman mourning at the graveside. What police and the public did not know was that the murder had been planned for months. Patrizia, consumed by rage and a desire for revenge, had discussed killing Maurizio with Pina Auriemma beginning in late 1994. The conversations had been half serious at first, the kind of dark fantasies that people sometimes indulge without intending to act on them. But gradually, the fantasy became a plan. Pina, through her connections in Naples, reached out to figures who could make such things happen. She contacted Ivano Savioni, a hotel porter and small-time criminal with connections to more serious underworld figures. Savioni, in turn, contacted Benedetto Caraulo, a pizzeria owner with a past that included violence and crime. Caraulo agreed to carry out the killing for a fee. The conspiracy expanded to include Orazio Cicala, Caraulo's friend and accomplice, who would drive the getaway car. The planning was surprisingly amateurish. These were not hardened mafia assassins executing a carefully orchestrated hit. These were petty criminals and desperate people cobbling together a murder plot. They followed Maurizio to learn his routines. They stole the Renault to use as a getaway vehicle. They purchased an untraceable pistol. But they also made mistakes, left trails, talked too much. The motive, as articulated by Patrizia to Pina, it was revenge. Maurizio had humiliated her. He had abandoned her for another woman. He had taken away her identity as Mrs. Gucci, her access to wealth and status. But beyond revenge, there was also a financial calculation. Patrizia believed that if Maurizio died before remarrying, his assets would pass to their daughters, and as their mother, she would have some control over that inheritance. The murder was thus simultaneously deeply personal and coldly financial, a perfect encapsulation of how the Gucci family had learned to merge emotion and greed into a single toxic motivation. On the morning of March 27th, Caraulo waited outside Maurizio's office building. When his target appeared, he executed the plan. 4 shots, a quick departure. 50 million lire awaited him, roughly $30,000. A pittance for taking a human life, but a fortune to a struggling pizzeria owner. For months, the conspirators believed they had succeeded. Maurizio was dead. Patrizia collected her daughter's inheritance and began living more extravagantly, as if freed by his death. Pina Auriemma received her share of the payment for arranging the killing. The actual triggerman and getaway driver faded back into their obscure lives. It seemed, impossibly, that they might get away with it. But murder conspiracies rarely hold. They require too many people keeping too many secrets. Someone always talks, either out of guilt or greed or fear. In this case, the conspiracy began unraveling through financial disputes. The conspirators argued about payment. Patrizia was slow to deliver promised money. Resentments festered. In January 1997, almost 2 years after the murder, police received an anonymous tip suggesting they investigate Patrizia Reggiani. The tipster, later revealed to be Pina Auriemma, who had fallen out with Patrizia over money, provided enough information to focus the investigation. Police began surveillance. They tapped phones. They investigated financial transactions. And slowly, the conspiracy revealed itself. Pina, faced with pressure from investigators, agreed to cooperate. She provided detailed testimony about the planning of the murder, about Patrizia's role in orchestrating it, about the various conspirators and their motivations. Her testimony was problematic. She was an admitted co-conspirator with her own motives for shaping the narrative. But it was detailed and damning. In 1998, Italian prosecutors arrested Patrizia Reggiani, Pina Auriemma, Benedetto Ciraulo, Orazio Cicala, and Ivano Savioni. The trial that followed was sensational. Milan had seen nothing like it. A glamorous former socialite accused of hiring hitmen to murder her ex-husband, the heir to a legendary fashion empire. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists and spectators. Every detail was dissected in newspapers and on television. Italy, and much of the world, was fascinated. Patrizia's defense was that she had been mentally incapacitated at the time of the murder conspiracy. Her lawyers pointed to the brain tumor she had been treated for in 1992, arguing that it had affected her judgment and psychological state. They presented her as a woman driven temporarily insane by medical trauma and emotional betrayal. It was a sympathetic narrative, and for a while, it seemed it might work. But the prosecution presented a different portrait. They showed that Patrizia had been calculated and deliberate in planning the murder. They presented evidence of her discussions with Pina, her approval of the various conspirators, her willingness to pay for the killing. They portrayed her not as a victim of circumstance, but as the architect of a premeditated murder, motivated by wounded pride and greed. The testimony was devastating. Pina Auriemma described in detail how Patrizia had said, "I want him dead. I don't care how you do it, but I want him dead." She described how Patrizia had complained about Maurizio's relationship with Paola, how she obsessed over his movements and finances, how she celebrated when she learned the murder had been successfully carried out. Other witnesses corroborated elements of the conspiracy, creating a picture of a woman consumed by hatred and determined to destroy the man who had rejected her. In November 1998, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty. Patrizia Reggiani was convicted of arranging Maurizio Gucci's murder. She was sentenced to 29 years in prison. Pina Auriemma received 25 years. Benedetto Ciraulo, the triggerman, received life imprisonment. The others received lesser sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. Patrizia showed little emotion as the verdict was read. She maintained her innocence, insisting that she had been framed or that her mental state had prevented her from understanding her actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. She had wanted Maurizio dead, and she had made it happen. The murder of Maurizio Gucci was the culmination of everything toxic in the family's history. It was the logical endpoint of a worldview that reduced human relationships to power struggles, that viewed people as obstacles to be removed, rather than as individuals deserving of dignity. Patrizia had learned from the Guccis themselves that when someone stood between you and what you wanted, you destroyed them. The family had been destroying each other for decades, through lawsuits, betrayals, financial warfare. She simply took the principle to its ultimate conclusion. But Patrizia was not really a Gucci. She had been cast out, rejected, divorced. So why did she carry out this final, terrible act of the family drama? Perhaps because she had internalized their values so completely that even expulsion could not free her from them. She had defined herself entirely through her association with the Gucci name. When that association was severed, she was left with nothing but rage and a perverse loyalty to the destructive patterns she had witnessed for decades. Maurizio's murder was also a kind of liberation, though not one he lived to experience. In death, he became more sympathetic than he had ever been in life. The man who had destroyed family relationships and squandered an empire became, in retrospect, a victim of his family's dysfunction, of his ex-wife's pathology, of the corrosive effects of wealth and pride. His flaws were forgotten or minimized. He was remembered as a martyr to excess, a man whose greatest sin had been inheriting too much too soon. The actual tragedy, though, was more prosaic. Maurizio Gucci died because he had married a woman who could not accept rejection, who had learned from his family that power was the only thing that mattered, and who had access to criminals willing to kill for modest sums. He died on marble steps in Milan, not because of grand destiny or inevitable fate, but because of ordinary human weakness, amplified by extraordinary circumstance. The murder investigation and trial laid bare the final secrets of the Gucci family. The world now knew everything: the betrayals, the greed, the hatred, the violence. The dynasty that Guccio had built to elevate his family, to separate them from the masses, to make them aristocrats of taste, had instead destroyed them completely. The name survived. The people carrying it did not. When Investcorp forced Maurizio Gucci out in 1993, they inherited a company in crisis. Decades of family warfare had left Gucci operationally dysfunctional and financially unstable. The brand still possessed enormous value. The double G logo, the red and green stripe, the horsebit motif remained instantly recognizable symbols of luxury. But the business itself was bleeding money, bloated with costs, and lacking strategic direction. Investcorp's initial attempts to stabilize Gucci were conventional and largely unsuccessful. They brought in management consultants, tried to rationalize the product line, attempted cost-cutting measures, but the problems were deeper than inefficiency. Gucci had lost its identity. In the pursuit of growth, the brand had been licensed to hundreds of products: watches, perfumes, accessories, home goods. The indiscriminate licensing had diluted the brand's exclusivity. When everything carries the Gucci name, nothing feels special. By 1994, Investcorp was desperate. They needed someone with vision to rescue the brand, someone who understood luxury, but could also execute business strategy. They found that person in Domenico De Sole, an Italian-American lawyer who had been working with Gucci since the 1980s. De Sole was appointed CEO, and he immediately made a decision that would prove transformative. He hired a young designer named Tom Ford as creative director. Tom Ford was 33 years old, Texan by birth, trained at Parsons School of Design in New York. He had worked at Perry Ellis and Kathy Hardwick before joining Gucci in 1990, initially in a limited design role. But Ford possessed something rare. He understood that fashion was not just about clothes, but about projecting an image, creating desire, telling stories through aesthetic choices. He was also ambitious and confident in ways that sometimes bordered on arrogance, willing to take risks that more cautious designers would avoid. De Sole gave Ford unprecedented creative control. The mandate was clear: make Gucci relevant again, make it desirable, make it exclusive. Ford responded with a collection that debuted in 1995, the same year Maurizio was murdered, that shocked the fashion world with its overt sexuality and bold glamour. Models wore hip-hugging velvet trousers, silk shirts unbuttoned to reveal skin, stiletto heels. The aesthetic was provocative, unapologetically sensual, a complete departure from the staid, a conservative image Gucci had developed. The collection was a sensation. Fashion editors praised Ford's vision. Celebrities and style icons embraced the new Gucci. Within months, The brand was being discussed in magazines and worn on red carpets. Ford had accomplished something remarkable. He had made a 90-year-old heritage brand feel contemporary and dangerous. De Soleil supported Ford's creative vision with equally bold business decisions. He terminated most of the licensing agreements that had diluted the brand, pulling Gucci products from countless third-party manufacturers. This was painful in the short term. It meant walking away from licensing revenue, but essential for restoring exclusivity. He also raised prices significantly, understanding that luxury is often defined by inaccessibility. If middle-class consumers could afford Gucci, then Gucci wasn't truly luxury. The strategy worked spectacularly. By the late 1990s, Gucci's revenues were exploding. The company went from near bankruptcy to billion-dollar valuations in just a few years. Investcorp, recognizing the turnaround success, took Gucci public in 1995. The IPO was oversubscribed, reflecting investor confidence in the brand's resurrection. But this success created a new problem. Gucci was now a publicly traded company, no longer controlled by the family or even by a single private investor. The shares were available on the open market, which meant they were vulnerable to takeover. In 1999, Bernard Arnault, the French billionaire who controlled LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy, began quietly purchasing Gucci shares. Arnault was building a luxury conglomerate, they acquiring prestigious brands and consolidating them under LVMH's umbrella. Gucci was an obvious target, iconic, profitable, and potentially available. De Soleil and Ford were horrified by the prospect of LVMH control. They viewed Arnault as a predator who would subsume Gucci's identity into a corporate portfolio, destroying the autonomy that had enabled their creative success. They needed a white knight, an investor who would provide capital and protection without demanding creative control. They found that investor in François Pinault, another French billionaire, but one whose approach differed from Arnault's. Pinault controlled a retail and luxury conglomerate that would later become Kering. He agreed to invest in Gucci, purchasing a significant stake and providing the company with resources to resist LVMH's takeover attempt. The financial maneuvering was complex, involving Dutch holding companies and creative financial structures, but the outcome was clear. Gucci remained independent, controlled by management rather than by LVMH. The takeover battle was significant beyond its immediate financial implications. It represented the final severing of any connection between the Gucci family and the Gucci company. The business was now firmly in the hands of professional managers and global investors. The family members who had once fought so viciously for control were now irrelevant to the company's operations and strategy. Their names appeared in the brand's history, but they had no voice in its future. For the surviving Gucci family members, this was a strange and bitter reality to accept. They still carried the name. They still benefited from past sales of their shares, but they were spectators now, watching others profit from what their grandfather had built. Some, like Paolo's children or Aldo's descendants, struggled financially despite their famous name. The family fortune had been dissipated through legal battles, bad investments, and lavish spending. The name that had once guaranteed wealth now primarily guaranteed attention, and not always the kind anyone wanted. The contrast between the family's collapse and the brand's resurrection was stark and ironic. Gucci The company thrived precisely because Gucci the family no longer controlled it. Professional managers like De Soli could make rational decisions unencumbered by familial politics. Designers like Ford could take creative risks without navigating family hierarchy. Investors could expect returns based on business performance rather than on which family member was currently ascendant in internal power struggles. This raised an uncomfortable question. Had the family always been the problem? Had Guccio's vision been correct, but his decision to make the business dynastic fundamentally flawed? Perhaps great companies require professional management, clear hierarchies, and rational decision-making rather than the emotional chaos of family dynamics. Perhaps luxury brands are better served by hired creatives than by inheritors who mistake their last name for talent. Tom Ford continued to create collections that defined late 1990s and early 2000s fashion. His Gucci was sexual, glamorous, and aspirational, everything the family's Gucci had ceased to be during their years of internal warfare. Madonna wore Gucci to award shows. Gwyneth Paltrow carried Gucci handbags. The brand became synonymous with a particular kind of confident, unapologetic luxury. In 2004, Ford and De Soli left Gucci after disagreements with François Pinault over creative control and compensation. Their departure was seen as potentially catastrophic. They had been credited with saving the brand, but Gucci survived the transition, hiring other talented designers and continuing to perform financially. This proved the most important lesson. The brand was bigger than any individual, including those who had rescued it. The Gucci family, meanwhile, scattered to the margins of relevance. Some family members attempted to trade on the name, launching businesses or seeking publicity. Others retreated into private life, preferring obscurity to the constant reminder of their lost empire. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Guccio grew up knowing they were connected to something famous, but unable to access the wealth and power that name had once represented. Patrizia Reggiani, serving her prison sentence, became an object of morbid fascination. Journalists wrote profiles. Books were written about the murder. She was interviewed in prison, where she maintained an odd dignity, discussing her crime with a mixture of defiance and rationalization. She received a work release program in 2014 and was fully released in 2016, having served 18 years. She returned to Milan, still styling herself as a figure of importance, still connected in her mind to the Gucci legacy, despite having destroyed its last family representative. In 2021, a major film was released telling the story of the Gucci family, starring Lady Gaga as Patrizia and Adam Driver as Maurizio. The film brought renewed attention to the family's saga, introducing their story to a generation that had no memory of the actual events. The movie took liberties with facts, compressed timelines, dramatized events, but in its broad strokes it captured something true. The way wealth and pride and family loyalty had combined into a toxic mixture that destroyed everyone it touched. The Gucci family's living descendants watched the film with mixed emotions. Some were offended by the portrayal. Others were resigned to being characters in a story they could not control. The family that had once controlled its own narrative, that had carefully crafted its image as Italian nobility, it was now subject to Hollywood's interpretation. They could object, issue statements, complain about inaccuracies, but they could not change the fundamental reality. Their story was no longer theirs to tell. The company continued to thrive in the 2020s, adapting to new markets and new consumer generations. Creative directors came and went, each bringing their own vision while respecting the brand's heritage. Revenues climbed to billions annually. Gucci stores opened in China, India, Southeast Asia. The double G logo appeared on products undreamed of in Guccio's time: sneakers, sweatshirts, phone cases. But this success belonged to Kering, to professional managers, to designers and marketers and investors. The Gucci family received none of it. They had sold their shares decades earlier. During the family wars that consumed the 1980s and 1990s, the money from those sales had been spent or squandered or lost in bad investments. What remained was the name and the memories and the knowledge that they had possessed something extraordinary and destroyed it through greed and pride and inability to transcend their worst instincts. The collapse of the family's control was complete and irreversible, but the empire itself survived. Perhaps proving that empires are more durable than the families that create them. Institutions outlast individuals. Brands outlast bloodlines. The tragedy of the Gucci family was that they built something immortal, but could not stop themselves from destroying their own connection to it. Walk into any major city in the world today, and you will find a Gucci store. The windows display handbags and shoes and accessories that carry price tags most people could never justify. Inside, sales associates treat customers with practiced deference, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity, even as they calculate commissions. The double G logo appears on products from high fashion to streetwear collaborations. Teenagers wear Gucci t-shirts purchased with birthday money or credit cards. Celebrities drape themselves in Gucci for red carpet appearances, generating countless social media impressions. The brand's annual revenues exceed $10 billion. This is Gucci's legacy in its purest form. He created something that outlasted him, that transcended him, that became independent of any individual person, including himself. The brand he founded has survived world wars, economic recessions, fashion trend cycles, and the complete self-destruction of his own family. In business terms, this is the ultimate success. Guccio dreamed of creating something permanent, and he succeeded beyond what even his ambitious imagination likely conceived. But the Gucci family's legacy is not the brand's success. It is their exclusion from that success. It is the fact that the name they made famous no longer belongs to them in any meaningful way. They are footnotes in their own story, historical curiosities who occasionally give interviews or issue statements, but exercise no control over the company that carries their name. They are, in effect, licensed properties, their family history used by marketers and filmmakers and biographers to add depth and drama to a brand that no longer needs them. This outcome was not inevitable. Other luxury families have maintained control of their brands across generations. The Hermès family still controls Hermès. The Wertheimer family controls Chanel. These families navigated the same challenges the Guccis faced: succession planning, creative direction, balancing tradition with innovation. They succeeded where the Guccis failed. Why? The answer lies not in business strategy, but in character and psychology. The Hermès family created governance structures that prevented any single individual from wielding absolute power. They understood that family businesses require compromise, that shared authority is better than no authority. They recognized that the business was larger than any individual ego. The Gucci family never learned these lessons, or rather, They learned them too late, after irreparable damage had been done. Guccio established a template of authoritarian control that his sons tried to replicate. But absolute authority cannot be divided among multiple people. Multiple absolute monarchs cannot coexist. The contradiction was fundamental and fatal. What makes the Gucci story particularly tragic is that the family members were not by nature evil people. They were flawed humans given extraordinary wealth and power, with no wisdom about how to handle either. Aldo was charismatic and driven. Rodolfo was creative and aesthetically sophisticated. Maurizio was charming, if somewhat weak-willed. Paolo was talented but insecure. These were ordinary human traits, neither particularly admirable nor particularly contemptible. In ordinary circumstances, these people might have lived unremarkable lives, their flaws contained by normal constraints. But wealth removed those constraints. Money allowed their worst impulses to flourish unimpeded. Pride became arrogance. Ambition became ruthlessness. Insecurity became vindictiveness. The family's wealth acted like a chemical catalyst, accelerating and intensifying reactions that might otherwise have remained dormant. Patrizia Reggiani is perhaps the most emblematic figure in this tragedy, precisely because she was not born into the family. She married into it, and in doing so, she revealed what the Gucci worldview did to those who embraced it. Patrizia learned from the family that power was paramount, that identity came from status, that people who betrayed you deserved destruction. She absorbed these lessons so thoroughly that she remained loyal to them even after being expelled from the family. When she arranged Maurizio's murder, she was acting on principles the Guccis themselves had taught her. The moral of the Gucci family story is not that wealth corrupts, though that is part of it. The deeper lesson is about the dangers of confusing commercial success with human worth, of building identity around material achievement, of raising children to believe they are fundamentally superior to others. Guccio Gucci created luxury goods, but he also created a philosophy of life that equated quality craftsmanship with personal superiority. This philosophy poisoned his family. There is something profoundly sad about the surviving Gucci family members. They live ordinary lives in the shadow of an extraordinary name. They attend events where people ask about their family history, and they must recite a story of murder and betrayal and loss. They watch as actors portray their relatives in films, as journalists write books about their family's dysfunction, as business schools use their family as a case study in catastrophic failure. Some family members have tried to reclaim their narrative. They have given interviews insisting that the real family was not as bad as depicted, that the love was real, that the good times were genuine. These claims are probably true. Families are complex. Even dysfunctional families have moments of genuine affection and shared joy. But these moments do not erase the larger pattern of destruction, and they ring hollow against the incontrovertible facts of lawsuits and betrayals and murder. The Gucci story also raises uncomfortable questions about our relationship with luxury brands. When we purchase Gucci products, what are we buying? We think we are buying quality, status, beauty, but we are also buying into a mythology that was built on exploitation and maintained through carefully constructed scarcity. We are participating in a system that tells us objects can confer worth, that the right handbag or the right shoes can elevate us above the masses. This mythology is not unique to Gucci. It is the foundation of the entire luxury industry. But the Gucci family's implosion reveals the darkness at the heart of this mythology. The people who created the brand, who lived most intimately with the reality behind the image, were destroyed by their own creation. If proximity to luxury destroyed the Guccis, what does that say about our cultural obsession with expensive goods? Perhaps it says nothing. Perhaps the Guccis were simply one family that failed to manage their inheritance. Other luxury dynasties have survived. Other families have found ways to balance wealth with wisdom, power with humility. The problem was not luxury itself, but how the Guccis approached it, as a marker of superiority, rather than as a product they made and sold. In the end, Gucci achieved immortality of a sort. His name will endure as long as the brand exists, which could be centuries. He created something beautiful and valuable that brought pleasure to millions of people. This is no small accomplishment. Most people leave no lasting mark on the world. Gucci created an empire. But he also created suffering. His children and grandchildren lived diminished lives, consumed by conflicts he set in motion. His great-grandchildren carry a name that comes with more burden than benefit. One of his grandsons was murdered by his own ex-daughter-in-law, shot down on marble steps because he had the misfortune to be born into a family that had forgotten how to love without conditions. The price of the Gucci empire was the Gucci family. Whether that price was worth paying depends on what you value. If you value commercial success above all else, then perhaps the outcome was acceptable. The brand survived and thrived. Millions of people enjoy Gucci products. Thousands of people have jobs because of the company Gucci founded. But if you value human flourishing, family bonds, lives lived with dignity and love, then the Gucci story is a catastrophe. Every member of the family was diminished by their connection to the brand. Even those who profited financially paid in psychological damage, in broken relationships, in the constant anxiety that comes from equating your worth with your wealth. There is a photograph of Gucci from the 1940s. He is standing in his Florence shop, surrounded by leather goods he crafted. His expression is serious, almost stern. He looks like a man who knows he has built something significant, but who does not yet understand the price that significance will exact. Looking at that photograph now, knowing everything that followed, it is impossible not to feel a sense of tragic foreknowledge. This is the man who set everything in motion. This is where it all began. What would Gucci think if he could see Gucci today? Would he be proud that his name endures, that his brand is known worldwide? Or would he be devastated that his family was expelled from the empire he built, that his grandchildren destroyed each other in pursuit of control he had taught them to value above all else? We cannot know. Gucci died in 1953. Early enough to miss the worst of the family wars. He witnessed conflicts between his sons, but did not live to see murder and betrayal and total collapse. Perhaps this was a mercy. Perhaps it would have broken him to know what his legacy ultimately wrought. The Gucci family story is not unique. History is full of dynasties that rose and fell, of families that achieved extraordinary success only to implode from internal conflict. The Krupps, the Rothschilds, the Kennedys, each family offers its own variation on the theme of wealth's corrupting influence and the difficulty of maintaining unity across generations. But the Gucci story is uniquely modern in its specificity. It is a story about luxury branding, about the commercialization of identity, about how we project meaning onto objects, and how those objects reflect back our own insecurities and desires. It is a story about how capitalism transforms everything it touches, including family relationships. It is a story about the globalization of culture and the creation of worldwide brands that transcend national boundaries and cultural differences. Most fundamentally, it is a story about power. Who has it? Who wants it? What people will do to get it and keep it. The Gucci family was destroyed not by poverty or oppression or bad luck, but by the very thing they pursued most ardently: power and the wealth that makes power possible. They achieved what they wanted and discovered that achievement was a trap, that the crown they fought for was made of thorns. Today, young people wear Gucci sweatshirts and carry Gucci bags without knowing anything about the family that created the brand. They know it is expensive. They know it conveys status. They know it looks good in Instagram photos. The history is irrelevant to them, and perhaps that is appropriate. Products should be judged by their quality and design, not by the biography of their creators. But there is value in remembering. There is value in understanding that behind every luxury brand is a human story, and that human stories are often darker and more complex than marketing materials suggest. The Gucci Double G logo is elegant and instantly recognizable. It is also a marker of a family's self-destruction, a symbol of everything that can go wrong when people confuse material success with human worth. The Gucci family's tragedy offers no easy lessons. We cannot simply say, greed is bad, or family is important, and feel that we have understood something profound. The truth is more nuanced and more disturbing. The Guccis were not monsters. They were people who wanted what most people want: success, respect, security, legacy. They pursued these goals with the tools and values their culture provided, and in doing so, they destroyed themselves. Perhaps the real lesson is about humility. Perhaps the warning is against hubris, against the belief that success in one domain translates to wisdom in others. Guccio was a genius craftsman and an astute businessman, but these skills did not make him a wise father or a good family leader. His sons inherited his talents, but not the wisdom to use them constructively. Each generation repeated the mistakes of the previous one, unable to break free from patterns established decades earlier. The pattern is broken now. The family no longer controls the company. The dynasty has ended. What remains is the brand and the story, both of which will outlast everyone involved in the original drama. In 50 years, no one will remember Maurizio Gucci's murder or Patrizia Reggiani's trial, except as historical footnotes. But people will still buy Gucci handbags and wear Gucci shoes, and the company will continue generating billions in revenue. This is Guccio's true legacy. He created something that proved bigger than family, bigger than individual humans, bigger than the people who tried to control it. He wanted to build a dynasty. Instead, he built a brand. The brand survived. The dynasty did not. Whether he would view this outcome as success or failure is unknowable. What we can know is that the price was high. Multiple lives were ruined or ended. A family was shattered beyond repair. Relationships were poisoned by money and power. And all of it, every betrayal and lawsuit, and ultimately the murder itself, can be traced back to a decision Guccio Gucci made in 1921. To build not just a business, but an empire, and to raise his sons to believe that empire was their birthright and their prison. The Gucci empire stands. The family crumbled. That juxtaposition is the story's final irony, and its most haunting lesson. Some things we build outlast us. Some things we build destroy us. And sometimes the two are the same.